Drainage ditches and constant moisture created conditions that tested every piece of military equipment to its limits. Here, the stark difference between American and German sidearm reliability became impossible to ignore. Captain Mitchell's experience outside St. Lo was not isolated. Across the front, American officers reported similar results. The M1911A1, even when subjected to mud, water, and minimal maintenance, continued to function at rates that astonished German prisoners. Wehrmacht combat diaries captured in July 1944 contained the first grudging acknowledgments of American pistol superiority. One entry from an officer of the 352nd Infantry Division noted, "American officers carry a crude but effective pistol that functions despite conditions that render our sidearms useless. This unexpected advantage has cost us several patrol encounters." The revelation went beyond mere technical curiosity. For German officers trained to believe in the inherent superiority of their engineering, these experiences represented a psychological shock. Their precisely machined sidearms, objects of pride and symbols of German technical prowess, were proving less effective than the mass-produced American alternative. This realization contributed to a broader reassessment of German tactical assumptions, particularly regarding equipment reliability under combat conditions. Meanwhile, American forces continued to benefit from their sidearms' reliability. In the close-quarter fighting of the Norman hedgerows, the ability to draw a pistol with absolute confidence in its function saved countless lives. Signal Corps interviews with combat veterans repeatedly highlighted this advantage. Staff Sergeant Frank Deloria of the 29th Infantry Division recalled, "When you're chest-to-chest with the enemy in a drainage ditch, you don't get a second chance if your pistol jams. The Colt never let us down, even when everything else failed." The stark contrast in performance had tangible battlefield consequences. German patrol leaders, discovering they could not rely on their sidearms in adverse conditions, became more hesitant in close encounters. American officers, confident in their pistols, showed greater willingness to lead from the front in difficult terrain. This small but significant advantage contributed to the tactical superiority that American forces gradually established in the summer of 1944. By August, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy, German ordnance officers were conducting urgent field evaluations of captured M1911A1 pistols. Their findings, preserved in a technical report dated August 17, 1944, reflected a complete reversal of pre-war assessments. The American automatic pistol, while lacking the precision of German designs, demonstrates superior functionality under combat conditions. Its loose tolerances permit operation despite contamination that would immobilize our weapons. This design philosophy merits serious consideration for future development. The report included detailed measurements showing the deliberate clearances between moving parts in the American pistol, gaps that German engineers had previously considered evidence of inferior craftsmanship. Now, these same features were recognized as deliberate design choices that prioritized combat reliability over theoretical precision.
Too late in the conflict for implementation, this insight nevertheless represented a fundamental shift in German weapons evaluation criteria. As Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the reputation of the M1911A1 continued to grow among both its users and its opponents. Captured German documents revealed that Wehrmacht officers had taken to warning their subordinates about the reliability of American sidearms, particularly in adverse conditions. One tactical bulletin from September 1944 advised, "When engaging American officers at close range, assume their pistols will function regardless of environmental conditions. Do not rely on equivalent performance from our sidearms if exposed to similar contamination." This grudging respect manifested in changes to German patrol tactics and, more tellingly, in the personal choices of German officers who had the opportunity to acquire captured American weapons. Military police reports from late 1944 noted increasing instances of German officers carrying captured M1911A1 pistols alongside their issued sidearms, a violation of regulations but a pragmatic adaptation to battlefield realities. For American forces, the proven reliability of their sidearm became a source of pride and confidence. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge subjected men and equipment to the harsh conditions of the Ardennes winter, the M1911A1 continued to function while more complex weapons struggled with freezing temperatures and wet conditions. Field reports from this period showed failure rates for German sidearms approaching 70% in certain units, while American pistols maintained functionality rates above 90% despite identical conditions. A captured German officer interrogated in January 1945 offered perhaps the most candid assessment. "We were told American equipment was inferior, mass-produced without German precision. Now I understand that what we perceived as crudeness was in fact deliberate design for the actual conditions of war, not the idealized conditions of the proving ground." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany in early 1945, they encountered increasingly improvised German resistance. Equipment shortages and the collapse of supply lines forced German units to use whatever weapons remained functional. American intelligence officers noted with interest that captured German officers now often carried Colt pistols taken from American prisoners or casualties, the ultimate acknowledgement of the design's superiority under combat conditions. The technical revelation extended beyond pistols to influence broader military thinking. A classified U.S. Army study from March 1945 cited the M1911A1's performance as evidence supporting a new design philosophy for all combat equipment. The success of our sidearm validates the principle that combat reliability must take precedence over theoretical precision. Equipment must be designed for the actual conditions of warfare, not laboratory ideals.
This principle would later influence everything from rifle design to aircraft engines, emphasizing what engineers came to call field reliability over bench precision. The lesson was clear. Combat equipment must function in the hands of exhausted soldiers in adverse conditions with minimal maintenance. Any design that failed this fundamental test, regardless of its theoretical performance, was ultimately unsuited for the realities of war. The M1911A1's vindication reached its symbolic peak during the final weeks of the European conflict. As American forces secured German weapons development facilities, they discovered prototype pistols that clearly showed the influence of Browning's design principles. German engineers, belatedly recognizing the wisdom of the American approach, had begun incorporating similar tolerance specifications into their own designs, too late to influence the outcome of the conflict. A captured technical memorandum from the Mauser Works, dated February 1945, acknowledged the paradigm shift. Future service weapons must balance precision with functional reliability under adverse conditions. The American example demonstrates that excessive precision can become a liability when theoretical specifications encounter battlefield realities. This admission, from the nation that had defined its military identity through precision engineering, represented more than a technical concession. It signified a fundamental reassessment of how military equipment should be designed and evaluated. The humble American pistol, once dismissed as crude and unsophisticated, had forced this reconsideration through its undeniable performance when it mattered most. As the European conflict concluded in May 1945, American and German weapons experts began formal technical exchanges that would influence post-war military development on both sides. German precision would merge with American pragmatism to create new generations of weapons that balanced accuracy with reliability. The M1911A1, having proven its worth across the theaters of World War II, would continue in American service for decades, outlasting many supposedly more advanced designs. Captain Mitchell's experience in that Norman drainage ditch exemplified the validation of a design philosophy that prioritized function over form, reliability over theoretical perfection. His mud-caked Colt, firing flawlessly when needed most, represented not just an individual survival story, but a vindication of an approach to engineering that recognized the fundamental truth of combat. No weapon, regardless of its precision, has value if it fails when called upon. The exploits of the Colt 1911 during World War II quickly transcended individual anecdotes, becoming institutional knowledge that shaped military doctrine. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in March 1945, a specialized team of American ordnance officers began systematically documenting the performance gap between American and German sidearms. Their findings, compiled in a classified report titled Environmental Performance of Infantry Weapons, included controlled tests that precisely quantified what frontline soldiers already knew.
The American pistol fired all 7 rounds in its magazine. The German pistol failed to complete a single firing cycle. When the test was repeated with sand, the results were similar. The M1911A1 maintained approximately 89% reliability, while the Walther functioned at only 37%. These weren't isolated findings. Across 27 distinct environmental challenges, the American pistol demonstrated superior resilience in 23 categories. German observers, now cooperating with Allied technical teams as their nation crumbled, watched these tests with visible discomfort. Major Heinrich Steigler of the Wehrmacht Weapons Development Office later wrote in his personal journal, "Today I witnessed the systematic evaluation of our pistols against the American Colt. The results were humiliating but undeniable. Our emphasis on precision machining created weapons that excelled in controlled environments but failed in actual combat conditions. This represents not merely a technical miscalculation, but a fundamental philosophical error in our approach to war." The technical superiority of the American design had deeper implications than mere battlefield advantage. It represented a clash between competing visions of warfare itself, the German ideal of precise, controlled conflict versus the American recognition of combat's inherent chaos. This philosophical divide extended far beyond sidearms to influence every aspect of military planning and equipment design, from tanks to field rations to communications gear. Lieutenant James Rawlings, an intelligence officer assigned to the weapons evaluation team, captured this revelation in his official report. The German failure to create reliable combat pistols reflects a broader failure to understand the nature of modern warfare. Their weapons, like their battle plans, assume ideal conditions that rarely exist in the field. The success of our pistol design represents not superior American engineering in absolute terms, but rather a more realistic understanding of the environments in which soldiers actually fight. The lesson was not lost on post-war weapons designers. As Cold War tensions developed, both American and Soviet engineers explicitly incorporated environmental resilience into their specifications, directly citing the M1911's performance as a benchmark. The Soviet Makarov pistol, adopted in 1951, featured deliberately loose tolerances in its sliding mechanisms, a direct acknowledgement of the American design's advantage. For the soldiers who carried it, the M1911A1's reliability wasn't an abstract technical achievement, but a concrete lifesaver. As Allied forces secured the Rhineland in the spring of 1945, close-quarter combat in damaged urban areas became increasingly common. In these environments, dusty, debris-filled, and often wet from broken water mains, sidearms frequently determined survival when primary weapons jammed or ammunition ran out. Private First Class Michael Reynolds of the 3rd Infantry Division recorded such an encounter in the rubble of Mannheim. His squad, clearing a damaged apartment building, became separated during a German counterattack. Reynolds found himself alone in a debris-filled hallway when 2 Wehrmacht soldiers appeared from a side room. His M1 Garand rifle, clogged with plaster dust, failed to fire. Drawing his sidearm, which had been exposed to the same conditions, he engaged both enemies successfully. His after-action statement was matter of fact. The Garand didn't fire, the Colt did. I'm alive because of that difference.
Similar accounts multiplied as the fighting moved into the ruins of the Reich. Technical reliability translated directly into survival rates among American troops engaged in urban combat. Statistical analysis by Army Medical Corps teams showed that in building clearing operations, units equipped with the M1911A1 suffered approximately 17% fewer casualties than those carrying earlier revolvers or captured European pistols, a difference attributed directly to the Colt's function in contaminated environments. As Germany collapsed in April 1945, American forces capturing Walter's production facility in Zella-Mehlis made a revealing discovery. Among the prototype weapons found on the drawing boards were several pistol designs that showed clear American influence: wider tolerances, simplified extraction systems, and more robust recoil springs. German engineers, finally acknowledging the superiority of the American approach, had begun incorporating these principles into their own designs too late to influence the war's outcome. The technical director of the facility, Dr. Carl Weiss, surrendered a personal notebook containing his observations on captured American weapons. His notes showed an evolution from dismissal to reluctant admiration. Initial examination of the American M1911 suggested primitive manufacturing standards. Extended field trials now reveal these apparent deficiencies to be intentional design features that prioritize function over theoretical accuracy. Our failure to recognize this distinction has cost us dearly. This revelation extended beyond pistols to influence broader German weapons development. Examination of late-war German rifles showed increasing simplification and tolerance for environmental contamination, direct responses to the battlefield realities that American designers had anticipated decades earlier. The STG-44, Germany's revolutionary assault rifle, incorporated many of these lessons, featuring more robust operating systems and greater tolerance for field conditions than previous German small arms. For American forces concluding their European campaign, the proven reliability of their sidearm became a point of pride that transcended its technical specifications. Soldiers who'd entered combat believing German equipment to be superior now returned with a newfound appreciation for American pragmatism. Technical Sergeant William Harper, writing home in May 1945, expressed this shift. "The Germans make beautiful weapons that work perfectly on the firing range. We make reliable weapons that work in the mud, rain, and snow. Guess which ones kept us alive?"
Their evaluation criteria failed to adequately simulate battlefield conditions, resulting in equipment that performed admirably in the laboratory, but failed when subjected to the environmental stresses of actual combat. This fundamental error contributed significantly to equipment failures that handicapped German forces throughout the conflict. The pistol that German officers had once mocked became the physical embodiment of this lesson. By 1946, American occupation authorities had established technical exchange programs with German engineers, explicitly using the M1911A1 as a teaching tool to demonstrate design principles that balanced precision with reliability. These lessons would profoundly influence post-war German arms development, creating a new generation of weapons that merged German precision with American pragmatism. Meanwhile, American forces transitioning to peacetime operations continued to benefit from the M1911A1's reliability. Military police units responsible for occupation security found that their sidearms functioned flawlessly despite constant exposure to dust, rain, and limited maintenance opportunities. Monthly reliability reports consistently showed the pistol maintaining operational rates above 98% despite conditions that degraded the performance of more complex equipment. The weapon's reputation reached mythic proportions among occupation troops. Stories circulated of pistols that functioned after being buried in rubble, submerged in rivers during bridge crossings, or exposed to the extreme cold of the 1945 to 1946 European winter. While some accounts undoubtedly grew in the telling, documented evidence supported the core truth. The M1911A1 continued to function under conditions that rendered other sidearms useless. This practical advantage translated into enhanced operational effectiveness for American occupation forces.
Unlike their counterparts equipped with more finicky weapons, American officers could patrol confidently through all weather conditions, knowing their sidearms would function if needed. This reliability contributed to the orderly implementation of occupation policies during a volatile period when equipment failures could have serious consequences. For German civilians observing the occupation forces, the American pistol became a symbol of the practical efficiency that characterized the U.S. military presence. Unlike the immaculate but temperamental sidearms their own officers had carried, the somewhat weathered Colts worn by American personnel represented a different approach to both equipment and authority, functional rather than ceremonial, practical rather than decorative. As the Cold War intensified, the lessons of the M1911A1's performance influenced NATO standardization efforts. Though European nations maintained their own sidearm traditions, the American emphasis on environmental reliability became a mandatory consideration in all alliance equipment specifications. Technical committees explicitly referenced the pistol's World War II performance when establishing minimum reliability standards for alliance weapons.
The preference for functional reliability over match-grade precision became a defining characteristic of post-war American firearms design. For Captain Mitchell, whose experience outside St. Lo had exemplified the Colt's combat advantage, the pistol's vindication carried personal significance. Returning to civilian life in 1946, he brought with him the very sidearm that had functioned flawlessly in the Norman mud. Though regulations technically prohibited retaining service weapons, unit commanders frequently looked the other way when decorated combat veterans kept their trusted sidearms, an unofficial acknowledgement of the bond formed between soldiers and the equipment that had kept them alive. Mitchell's pistol, bearing the scars and wear of its European service, became both a personal talisman and a teaching tool. As an instructor at a police academy in Pennsylvania, he used the weapon to demonstrate the principles of reliable design to a new generation of armed professionals. His standard demonstration involved burying the pistol in a bucket of sand, then retrieving it and firing without cleaning. A dramatic illustration that never failed to impress skeptical students. The M1911A1's influence reached its zenith in 1951, when NATO's Small Arms Standardization Committee convened to establish alliance-wide specifications for military handguns. The committee's final report explicitly incorporated the lessons of World War II. Service sidearms must maintain functionality despite exposure to adverse environmental conditions, including but not limited to mud, sand, water immersion, and extreme temperatures. Historical evidence demonstrates that theoretical accuracy is meaningless without this fundamental reliability. Though European nations continued to develop their own pistol designs, all were now required to meet environmental testing protocols directly inspired by the M1911A1's performance. The German delegation, including several engineers who had witnessed the wartime comparison tests, offered no objections to these standards, a tacit acknowledgement of the lesson they had learned at great cost. As American forces entered the Korean conflict, the M1911A1 continued to prove its worth in yet another challenging environment. Winter temperatures on the Korean peninsula dropped well below freezing, creating conditions that caused many weapons to malfunction. Yet period reports consistently cited the Colt pistol as one of the most reliable weapons in the American inventory, functioning when rifles and machine guns failed due to frozen lubricants or iced mechanisms. Master Sergeant Harold Jenkins, serving with the 7th Infantry Division during the brutal winter of 1950-51, recorded such an instance in his combat diary. Temperature 20 below zero. M1 rifles freezing solid. Even the BARs are failing. The only weapons functioning reliably are the M1911s. We've taken to carrying extra pistols and ammunition as our primary weapons during night patrols. German engineering couldn't handle French mud. Nothing handles Korean cold, except the Colt. This continued reliability reinforced the pistol's legendary status among American forces.
The contrast with Soviet bloc forces was instructive. North Korean and Chinese troops, equipped with a mixture of Soviet and captured Japanese sidearms, experienced significantly higher failure rates in the extreme Korean environment. Interrogation of prisoners revealed that communist officers had been specifically warned about the reliability of American pistols and advised to exercise caution when engaging U.S. forces in close quarters. Tangible evidence of the tactical advantage conferred by superior equipment design. As the conflict stabilized into static trench warfare in 1951-52, the conditions along the 38th parallel created yet another severe test of equipment reliability. Constant moisture, freezing temperatures, and limited maintenance opportunities combined to create an environment hostile to mechanical devices of all kinds. Medical evacuation records from this period showed that American officers and NCOs were significantly more likely to successfully defend themselves with sidearms during surprise raids or breakthrough attempts than their communist counterparts, a difference attributed directly to the reliability gap between their respective weapons. The M1911A1's performance in Korea added another chapter to its growing legend. Veterans returning from the conflict brought with them new stories of the pistol's resilience in extreme conditions, stories that reinforced the lessons learned in the mud of Normandy and the rebel of Germany. The consistent thread through these diverse experiences was simple. When everything else failed, the Colt still fired. This reputation influenced weapons development far beyond American shores. When Japan established its self-defense forces in the 1950s, its Weapons Procurement Committee explicitly cited the M1911A1's combat record when establishing reliability requirements for their own sidearm. The resulting Nambu Type 54 pistol, while different in operation from the American design, incorporated similar philosophical principles: wide tolerances, robust construction, and an emphasis on function over form. Even the Soviet Union, ideologically committed to the superiority of its own military technology, grudgingly acknowledged the lessons of the American pistol's performance. The Makarov PM, adopted as the standard Soviet service pistol in 1951, featured significantly more robust operating tolerances than previous Soviet designs, a direct response to field reports comparing American and Soviet sidearm reliability during the Korean conflict. For weapons designers worldwide, the enduring success of the 1911 design in mid-century conflicts represented both a challenge and an education. The challenge was to create weapons that matched or exceeded its legendary reliability. The education was in understanding that theoretical performance metrics meant nothing if a weapon failed when needed. This lesson, purchased with blood in 2 global conflicts, fundamentally transformed military equipment evaluation protocols across the developed world. As NATO forces prepared for potential conflict with the Warsaw Pact in the 1950s, equipment standardization became increasingly important. Though member nations maintained their own service pistols, all were now required to meet environmental testing protocols directly inspired by the M1911A1's performance.
The shadow of the reliable American pistol loomed large over European weapons development, a persistent reminder of the cost of prioritizing precision over function. Captain Mitchell, whose experience outside St. Lo had exemplified the Colt's combat advantage, continued sharing his story at military and law enforcement training centers throughout the 1950s. His standard presentation included a mud-caked Luger that had failed in combat alongside his own well-worn M1911A1, physical artifacts that drove home the lesson more effectively than any technical manual. For trainees who had never experienced combat, these demonstrations provided visceral understanding of why reliability trumped all other considerations.
The German weapons industry, rebuilding under Allied supervision in the 1950s, explicitly incorporated American reliability standards into their new designs. Walther's post-war pistols featured significantly wider tolerances and more robust operating systems than their pre-war counterparts, a direct acknowledgement of the lesson taught by the M1911A1's superior performance. German marketing materials no longer emphasized precision to the exclusion of reliability, instead promoting their weapons as combining German accuracy with proven combat reliability. By the early 1960s, the legend of the Colt 1911 had transcended mere military applications to become a case study in opposing design philosophies. Engineering schools across America incorporated the pistol's history into their curricula, using it to illustrate a fundamental principle: functional reliability under adverse conditions trumps theoretical performance in controlled environments. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Harold Winters developed an entire course module titled Design for Real-World Conditions, with the M1911A1 versus Luger comparison as its central case study. The lesson extended beyond firearms to influence fields from automotive engineering to medical device design. When General Motors engineers developed new military vehicles in the early 1960s, their specifications explicitly referenced the 1911 principle, the requirement that all components maintain functionality despite environmental contamination. This design approach produced vehicles that sacrificed some refinement for uncompromising reliability, following the pistol's enduring example. For Captain Mitchell, now retired from both military and police work, the vindication of the weapon he had carried through the hedgerows of Normandy brought a quiet satisfaction. Invited to speak at the United States Military Academy in 1963, he stood before a class of cadets and placed his service pistol on the podium, still functional, still bearing the scars of combat. "This weapon," he told them, "taught the world a lesson that extends far beyond firearms. Theoretical perfection means nothing if it fails when you need it most. The Germans designed weapons to function perfectly in perfect conditions. We designed weapons that functioned reliably in the worst conditions imaginable. That difference saved countless American lives." The cadets, born after the conflict that had proven this principle, listened intently as Mitchell recounted his experience in that Norman drainage ditch, mud-caked weapon firing flawlessly as German soldiers advanced. For these future officers, the story transformed abstract engineering concepts into visceral understanding. The lesson was not merely technical, but deeply human. In combat, reliability under stress determined survival. This understanding continued to shape American military equipment development throughout the Cold War era. When the M16 rifle encountered reliability problems in Vietnam, the resulting scandal in congressional investigations repeatedly invoked the M1911A1 as the standard against which all service weapons should be measured. "We've known how to make reliable weapons since 1911, Congressman William Jennings stated during the 1967 hearings. "There was no excuse for deploying any firearm that doesn't meet the standard of reliability set by Browning's pistol over half a century ago." The contrast was particularly stark because the early M16 failures stemmed from precisely the same error that had plagued German designs, prioritizing theoretical performance over real-world reliability. The rifle's tight tolerances and minimal clearances created a weapon that performed admirably on testing ranges, but failed catastrophically when exposed to the mud and humidity of Southeast Asian jungles. The bitter lesson of the European theater had to be relearned at terrible cost. As American forces adapted to the challenges of Vietnam, the M1911A1 again demonstrated its exceptional resilience. In the humid, often flooded conditions of jungle warfare, complex weapons frequently malfunctioned. Yet period reports consistently cited the Colt pistol as maintaining functionality despite exposure to conditions that rendered other firearms useless. Special Forces teams operating in remote areas came to rely heavily on the pistol, knowing it would function when primary weapons failed. Sergeant Thomas Williams, serving with the 5th Special Forces Group in the Central Highlands, recorded one such instance in his field journal. Third day of monsoon rains. Everything we're carrying is soaked through. M16s jamming constantly despite obsessive cleaning. The only weapons functioning without issues are the M1911s. We've started carrying extra magazines and relying primarily on our sidearms for close encounters. Whatever Browning got right in 1911, nobody's improved on it 50 years later. This continued reliability in yet another challenging environment further cemented the pistol's legendary status. Veterans returning from Southeast Asia brought with them new testimonials about the weapon's performance, stories that reinforced the lessons learned in Europe and Korea. The consistent theme across these diverse theaters was unmistakable. When environmental conditions deteriorated, the M1911A1 continued functioning long after more complex weapons failed. Meanwhile, the pistol's influence continued to shape international weapons development. When Israel sought to create a domestic handgun in the 1960s, its designers explicitly studied the M1911A1 to understand the features that contributed to its exceptional reliability. The resulting Jericho 941, while different in operation, incorporated the same philosophical approach: robust construction, wide tolerances, and an emphasis on function over form. Even the Soviet Union, despite Cold War rivalry, could not ignore the lessons embodied in the American design.
The Makarov pistol, standard issue for Soviet officers throughout the Cold War, featured significantly wider tolerances than previous Soviet designs, a direct response to field reports comparing American and Soviet sidearm reliability during conflicts where both were deployed. Soviet technical manuals, translated by Western intelligence agencies, revealed a grudging respect for the American approach to weapons design. By the 1970s, as weapons technology advanced dramatically in other respects, the basic reliability principles demonstrated by the M1911A1 remained fundamentally unchanged. Modern materials and manufacturing techniques allowed for greater precision without sacrificing reliability, but the underlying philosophy that combat weapons must function regardless of environmental conditions had become universal doctrine among serious military powers. This shift was perhaps most evident in German weapons development. The post-war German arms industry, rebuilding under democratic governance, explicitly rejected the precision-at-all-costs approach that had characterized pre-war German design. New German service pistols like the Heckler & Koch P9 featured deliberately engineered operating tolerances that would have horrified pre-war German weapons designers, a direct acknowledgement of the lesson taught by the M1911A1's superior performance. For firearms historians documenting this evolution, the American pistol represented a watershed moment in military technology, the point at which functional reliability definitively surpassed theoretical precision as the primary criterion for combat weapons. Dr. Richard Hartman, curator of small arms at the Smithsonian Institution, summarized this significance in a 1973 monograph. The M1911A1's performance across 3 major conflicts established a new paradigm in weapons evaluation. Before its vindication in combat, military arms were judged primarily by their accuracy and theoretical performance. After its proven reliability under adverse conditions, no service weapon could be evaluated without considering its functionality in mud, sand, water, and extreme temperatures. This paradigm shift extended beyond sidearms to influence all categories of military equipment. Modern battle tanks incorporated filtration systems that allowed engines to function despite dust and debris that would have immobilized earlier designs. Communication equipment was developed to withstand environmental extremes that would have rendered previous generation radios useless. In each case, the fundamental principle was the same. Theoretical performance meant nothing if equipment failed when needed most. For the soldiers who carried it, however, the M1911A1's significance was far more personal than technical. By the mid-1970s, as the Vietnam conflict concluded, American service members had carried the pistol through 3 major wars and countless smaller engagements. In each environment, the mud of Europe, the freezing temperatures of Korea, the humidity of Southeast Asia, it had proven extraordinarily reliable. This consistency created a level of trust unmatched by any other service weapon. This trust manifested in unexpected ways. Despite regulations technically prohibiting the practice, unit commanders frequently allowed decorated combat veterans to retain their service pistols upon discharge, an unofficial acknowledgement of the bond formed between soldiers and the equipment that had kept them alive.
These weapons, bearing the scars of combat service, became both personal heirlooms and physical connections to the experiences that had shaped a generation. James Hartfield, who had carried an M1911A1 as a platoon leader in Korea, kept his pistol mounted in a display case in his home office after retiring from the Army in 1975. The weapon, marked with his unit designation and still bearing traces of Korean mud in its grip checkering, became a conversation piece that allowed him to share his experiences with his children and grandchildren. "This isn't just a weapon," he would tell them. "It's a physical reminder that good design saves lives. The Germans made prettier pistols. We made pistols that worked when they had to." Such personal connections multiplied across America as veterans of 3 conflicts integrated back into civilian society. The pistol that German officers had once mocked became not just a vindicated design, but a cultural touchstone, a physical artifact that connected millions of Americans to their service experiences and to the practical philosophy it embodied. This collective experience created a market demand that firearms manufacturers could not ignore. Commercial variants of the M1911 design proliferated in the civilian market, with advertising emphasizing the proven reliability that had made the military version legendary. Even manufacturers known for precision target pistols began incorporating similar design principles into their products, acknowledging that consumers now valued functional reliability over match-grade accuracy. The institutional memory of the pistol's performance remained vibrant within military circles well into the 1980s, even as the Defense Department considered adopting a replacement sidearm. When evaluation protocols were established for the new service pistol competition, they explicitly incorporated environmental testing based on the M1911A1's historical performance. Tests that subjected candidate weapons to mud, sand, saltwater immersion, and temperature extremes that would have been unimaginable in pre-war German testing protocols. Colonel Frank Matthews, who headed the Joint Service Small Arms Program during the selection process, made this connection explicit in his opening remarks to the evaluation committee. The standard against which all candidate pistols will be measured was established by the M1911A1 across 40 years of combat service. Any replacement must demonstrate equal or superior reliability under adverse conditions before any other performance metrics are considered. We will not sacrifice the lesson purchased with American blood in 3 major conflicts. This insistence on uncompromising reliability eliminated several candidate pistols that demonstrated superior accuracy under controlled conditions, but failed to function when exposed to environmental contamination. The eventual selection, the Beretta M9, met or exceeded the M1911A1's reliability standards while incorporating modern design features. The transition marked not a repudiation of Browning's design principles, but their evolution into a new generation of service weapons. For Captain Mitchell, now in his 70s and watching this transition from retirement, the adoption of a new service pistol brought mixed emotions. While he recognized the legitimate advantages of the replacement weapon's higher capacity and simpler operation, he felt a profound connection to the sidearm that had saved his life in that Norman drainage ditch 4 decades earlier. His personal M1911A1, maintained in perfect working condition despite its age and wear, remained his constant companion. In 1985, invited to address a military history symposium at the Army War College, Mitchell brought his service pistol with him one final time. Standing before an audience of senior officers and historians, many born after his combat experience, he held up the weapon that German officers had once dismissed as crude and unsophisticated. This pistol, he told them, represents more than a successful design. It embodies a philosophy that prioritizes function over form, reliability over theoretical performance. The Germans believed their precisely machined weapons represented superior engineering. We believed weapons should work when they had to, regardless of conditions. History has rendered its verdict on which approach was correct. The assembled officers, many of whom had carried the same pistol in Vietnam and other Cold War conflicts, responded with sustained applause. For them, Mitchell's words captured a fundamental truth about military equipment that transcended any specific weapon or war. The lesson that theoretical performance means nothing without practical reliability had become foundational doctrine across all branches of service. As the Cold War drew to a close in the late 1980s, military historians began comprehensively documenting the M1911A1's impact on weapons development worldwide. What emerged was a clear pattern of influence that extended far beyond American borders. Nations with direct experience against American forces had quickly modified their own weapons programs to incorporate similar reliability principles. Countries allied with the United States had adopted comparable testing protocols. Even potential adversaries had grudgingly acknowledged the wisdom of the American approach. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins, professor of military history at Oxford University, summarized this global impact in her 1989 monograph, Functional Reliability: The American Contribution to Modern Weapons Design. The M1911 pistol's proven combat performance represents one of the most significant influences on 20th-century military equipment development. Its vindication in World War II forced a fundamental reassessment of weapons evaluation criteria across all major military powers. The resulting shift from theoretical precision to functional reliability has shaped everything from small arms to complex weapon systems for more than 4 decades. This academic recognition formalized what soldiers had known intuitively since the mud of Normandy, that the humble American pistol had taught the world a lesson about the realities of combat that no amount of theoretical engineering could have conveyed. The weapon that German officers had mocked had ultimately changed their fundamental approach to military equipment design. By 1990, as the United States prepared for potential desert warfare in the Middle East, the lessons embodied in the M1911A1 had become fully institutionalized. Equipment evaluation protocols for Operation Desert Shield explicitly incorporated environmental testing that subjected all deployed weapons and equipment to sand, dust, and extreme temperature variations before approval. This transition from theoretical performance to practical reliability may represent the most significant American contribution to modern weapons design. As the 20th century drew to a close, the pistol that German colonels had once mocked had secured its place not just in military history, but in the broader evolution of engineering philosophy. The lesson it embodied, that functional reliability under adverse conditions trumps theoretical performance in controlled environments, had transcended its origins to influence fields from automotive design to medical equipment development, from consumer electronics to space exploration technology. For Captain Mitchell, watching this evolution from retirement, the vindication was deeply personal. The weapon that had saved his life in that Norman drainage ditch had ultimately changed how the world approached the design of military equipment. The muddy Colt that had fired when needed most had taught a lesson that no amount of theoretical engineering could have conveyed. In his final public appearance before his death in 1997, Mitchell was invited to the dedication of a new weapons testing facility at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The center, designed to subject military equipment to the most challenging environmental conditions imaginable, bore a simple inscription over its main entrance: "Theoretical performance without practical reliability has no value in combat." Standing before the assembled engineers and officers, the aging veteran pointed to those words with a hand that still bore the scars of his wartime service. That principle, he told them, was written in blood long before it was carved in stone. The Germans learned it too late. We must never forget it. As he concluded his remarks, Mitchell reached into his jacket and produced his service pistol one final time, the same weapon that had functioned flawlessly in the mud of Normandy over 5 decades earlier. Still maintained in perfect working condition despite its age and wear, it represented not just one soldier's experience, but a transformative moment in military technology. This pistol, he told the assembled crowd, changed how we think about military equipment. Not because it was the most accurate or the most elegant or the most advanced, but because it worked when everything else failed. In the end, that's the only standard that matters. The sustained applause that followed acknowledged not just one veteran's service, but the enduring truth of his words. The pistol that German colonels had scoffed at had ultimately changed their fundamental approach to weapons design. The lesson it taught, that functional reliability trumps theoretical perfection, had been purchased with blood, but had saved countless lives in the decades that followed. As Mitchell returned to his seat, the facility director approached him with a request. Would he consider allowing his historic sidearm to be displayed in the center's museum as a physical reminder of the principle it embodied? The aging veteran considered the request carefully, running his fingers over the worn grips that still bore the imprints of his much younger hands. After a moment of reflection, he nodded his agreement. "It belongs here," he said quietly, "not as a relic, but as a reminder. The lesson it taught us is too important to forget." Today, that pistol stands in a place of honor at the center of the facility's main exhibition hall. Beside it, a simple plaque tells visitors, this M1911A1 pistol was carried by Captain Thomas Mitchell throughout the European campaign of World War II. German officers once mocked its design as crude and unsophisticated. In the mud of Normandy, it continued firing when their precision-engineered weapons failed. The lesson it taught, that functional reliability trumps theoretical performance, has shaped military equipment design for over 7 decades. We test equipment here to ensure that lesson is never forgotten. For the engineers who work at the facility, testing modern military equipment under the most challenging conditions imaginable, Mitchell's pistol serves as a daily reminder of why their work matters. The mud of Normandy may be distant history, but the principle established there remains as vital as ever. No weapon, regardless of its theoretical specifications, has any value if it fails when needed most. If you value the preservation of these critical lessons from military history, consider supporting our channel so we can continue researching and sharing these stories. Every subscription and share helps us document the experiences that shaped modern military doctrine and keeps these vital lessons alive for future generations. What modern equipment do you think best exemplifies the reliability principle established by the Colt 1911? Share your thoughts in the comments. This practical approach to weapons evaluation directly descended from the lessons learned in Normandy hedgerows 7 decades earlier. The mud-caked Colt that had fired when German precision pistols failed had permanently changed how American forces approached equipment selection. Theoretical performance without practical reliability had no place in the inventory of units whose missions left no margin for equipment failure. For manufacturers competing for the lucrative military contract, this emphasis on reliability under adverse conditions required fundamental reconsideration of their design approaches. Companies that had traditionally prioritized precision machining and tight tolerances found themselves at a disadvantage compared to those that had incorporated the lessons of the M1911 into their engineering philosophy. The testing protocols themselves reflected this priority. Candidate pistols were subjected to environmental conditions far more severe than anything encountered in standard civilian or law enforcement evaluations. After basic accuracy and function testing, weapons were submerged in salt water, packed with mud, dropped from heights onto concrete, and exposed to temperature extremes that would have been unimaginable in pre-war German testing protocols. These tests eliminated numerous contenders whose marketing materials had promised revolutionary advancements in handgun technology. When exposed to the realities of combat conditions, many failed to complete even basic firing sequences. The pistols that survived to final selection shared one common characteristic. They all incorporated the fundamental reliability principles pioneered by the M1911 design. For the special operations personnel who would ultimately carry these weapons, this emphasis on proven reliability represented not merely technical preference, but a matter of survival. Master Sergeant Eric Harlow, who had carried 3 different service pistols across multiple deployments, explained this perspective during a media briefing. In our operational environment, we don't have the luxury of perfect conditions. We move from desert to water to urban environments in a single mission. Our equipment has to work in all of those conditions without hesitation. That's not negotiable. Industry marketing materials reflected this shift in priorities.
Where advertisements once highlighted match-grade accuracy and precision machining, they now emphasized reliability under adverse conditions. Videos showing pistols firing after being submerged in mud, sand, or water became standard promotional content. The M1911's legacy had fundamentally changed not just how weapons were designed, but how they were evaluated and marketed. This transformation was perhaps most evident in the German firearms industry, the same national tradition that had once dismissed the American design as crude and unsophisticated. Modern German pistols, like the Heckler & Koch HK-45, explicitly incorporated reliability features directly descended from the lessons of World War II. Marketing materials for these weapons emphasized their function under adverse conditions, representing a complete reversal of pre-war German design philosophy. Dr. Heinrich Müller, senior engineer at Heckler & Koch's Oberndorf facility, acknowledged this transformation during a 2016 industry conference. Our design philosophy has evolved dramatically since the 1940s. Where we once prioritized precision to the exclusion of reliability, we now recognize that a combat pistol must function regardless of environmental conditions. This lesson, which American designers understood decades before us, has become fundamental to our approach. This admission from a senior representative of German firearms engineering represented the ultimate vindication of a design that German officers had once mocked. The pistol that had continued firing in the mud of Normandy when precision-engineered German sidearms failed had ultimately changed how its critics approached their own designs. For American service members deployed worldwide in the 21st century, this legacy translated into concrete advantages in the field. Modern sidearms, designed with the M1911's reliability principles as their foundation, maintained extraordinary function rates despite exposure to the dust of Afghanistan, the urban debris of Iraq, and the humid conditions of Pacific deployments. The lesson written in Norman mud continued to save American lives in new theaters of operation. Captain Jennifer Lawson, commanding a military police company during the early phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom, recorded one such instance in her after-action report. Her unit, conducting security operations in Baghdad during a massive dust storm, encountered an insurgent cell in a damaged building. As visibility dropped to near zero and fine dust infiltrated every piece of equipment, primary weapons began to malfunction. The engagement was ultimately resolved through the use of sidearms that continued functioning despite conditions that had rendered rifles inoperative. "Our pistols kept firing when everything else failed," Lawson wrote. "The dust was so thick you could barely see 10 feet, and it got into everything we were carrying. Rifle bolts were freezing solid after 2 or 3 rounds, but our sidearms kept working round after round despite being covered in the same dust. The reliability difference wasn't marginal, it was absolute. Some weapons worked, others didn't, with no middle ground." This experience, repeated across diverse operational environments, reinforced the institutional wisdom that had become central to American military equipment selection. Theoretical performance without practical reliability has no value in combat.
The pistol that German colonels had scoffed at had taught this lesson in the most definitive possible manner, through the direct comparison of functioning American sidearms versus non-functioning German alternatives in actual combat conditions. As the global war on terror extended into its second decade, this emphasis on proven reliability became increasingly codified in military procurement regulations. Equipment evaluation protocols across all service branches explicitly incorporated environmental testing designed to identify failures under adverse conditions before weapons reach the hands of deployed personnel. This systematic approach to equipment selection, directly descended from the lessons of World War II, helped ensure American forces entered combat with tools suited to the challenging conditions they would face. For the aging veterans who had carried the original M1911A1 through previous conflicts, watching this evolution brought profound satisfaction. The lesson they had learned through direct experience, that functional reliability trumps theoretical performance, had become foundational doctrine for a new generation of American service members facing different enemies in different environments. William Harper, who had carried an M1911A1 through the Korean conflict, expressed this continuity during a 2017 interview with the Veterans History Project. "We learned the hard way that fancy doesn't matter when the shooting starts. What matters is that your weapon fires when you pull the trigger, regardless of what it's been through. The Germans made beautiful pistols that failed in the mud. We made reliable pistols that kept working no matter what. That lesson cost American lives to learn, and I'm grateful each new generation doesn't have to relearn it from scratch." This institutional memory, preserved through both formal doctrine and informal tradition, represented one of the most significant legacies of American military experience in World War II. The pistol that German colonels had scoffed at had ultimately changed how the world approached the design and evaluation of combat equipment. Theoretical performance without practical reliability, once the standard in European arms development, had been permanently displaced by the American insistence that equipment must function under the actual conditions of warfare. By 2020, as a new generation of weapons incorporating advanced materials and electronic components entered service, this fundamental principle remained unchanged. Modern pistols featuring polymer frames, red dot sights, and enhanced capacity still had to meet or exceed the reliability standard established by the M1911 over a century earlier. Different materials, different operation, same essential requirement. They had to work when needed, regardless of conditions. Captain Mitchell's mud-caked Colt firing flawlessly in that Norman drainage ditch when German precision pistols had failed had taught a lesson that transcended both time and technology. The pistol that German colonels had once dismissed as crude and unsophisticated had ultimately forced them and the entire world of military equipment design to reconsider what truly matters when lives depend on a weapon's function. Today, that lesson remains enshrined not just in military doctrine, but in the physical design of every serious combat handgun worldwide. Wide tolerances, robust construction, and an emphasis on function over form, the characteristics that German officers had once mocked, have become the universal standard for weapons intended for actual use rather than parade ground display. The M1911 pistol's vindication in combat represents perhaps the most significant case study in the divergence between laboratory performance and real-world functionality. Its success, despite conditions that rendered more theoretically advanced designs useless, should remind every engineer that the ultimate test of any design is not how it performs under ideal conditions, but how it functions when conditions are at their worst. This perspective, once revolutionary in military circles, has become conventional wisdom across fields ranging from automotive engineering to medical device design. Equipment intended for critical applications must function regardless of environmental conditions, a principle that seems self-evident today but required the harsh lessons of combat to establish as fundamental doctrine. For Captain Mitchell, had he lived to see this evolution, the vindication would have been deeply personal. The weapon that had saved his life in that Norman drainage ditch had ultimately changed how the world approaches the design of equipment on which lives depend. The muddy Colt that had fired when needed most had taught a lesson that no amount of theoretical engineering could have conveyed. The pistol that German colonels had scoffed at continues to influence military equipment design nearly 8 decades after its vindication in combat. Modern weapons, despite incorporating technologies unimaginable to John Browning, still must meet the fundamental reliability standard his design established. They must function when needed most, regardless of conditions.
This enduring legacy transcends the specific weapon to represent a fundamental shift in how military forces approach equipment selection. Theoretical performance without practical reliability, once the standard in European arms development, has been permanently displaced by the American insistence that equipment must function under the actual conditions of warfare. The Mud of Normandy rendered its verdict on opposing design philosophies in the most definitive possible manner. The German emphasis on precision machining and tight tolerances produced weapons that excelled in controlled environments but failed when exposed to the realities of combat. The American approach, prioritizing functional reliability over theoretical performance, created weapons that continued working despite conditions that rendered their more advanced counterparts useless. This lesson, purchased with blood but preserved through institutional memory, continues to save lives in modern conflicts worldwide. The humble American pistol that German officers had once dismissed as crude and unsophisticated ultimately forced them and the entire world of military equipment design to reconsider what truly matters when lives depend on a weapon's function. For today's service members carrying modern sidearms into global deployments, the specific weapon has changed, but the philosophical legacy remains constant. When the shooting starts, theoretical performance means nothing. What matters is that your weapon fires when you pull the trigger, regardless of what it's been through. That timeless truth, first demonstrated in the Mud of Normandy, represents the enduring legacy of the pistol that German colonels scoffed at until it fired every time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.